At the global level, we support global climate change frameworks. For example, the United Nations Convention for Climate Change or technical support to APCS. Global to local level, we facilitate platform and discussions. For example, the Global Alliance on Climate Smart Agriculture. And finally, at the more national or local level, we work supporting planning at national level and also implementation. We have mentioned it yesterday a lot. Climate field school, farming field school, for example, is well ideated by FAO in the 80s in Indonesia, and we have spoke a lot about that yesterday. In this region, challenges are that we know the population is increasing, so the food production also needs to sustainably grow. But as we know, in the face of climate change, that in this sub-region is especially, as discussed yesterday, creating an increase of annual temperature and in general of the vagaries of climate. We need to have an adapted agriculture and address the greenhouse gas emissions for which agriculture is a major contribution, especially crop and livestock production. In the framework of the Paris Agenda, we have a way forward for countries in Asia and Pacific. We can see, wait a sec. Wow, okay. We can see the country from Asia and Pacific have all indicated different agricultural scope on their indicated national contribution, especially in crops, livestock, forestry, and fisheries, and aquaculture. And in particular, we have 256 priority action, and this needs to be seen also as an enabler for sustainable development goals. In this framework, adaptation is the most pressing concern for the countries in Asia and Pacific. But we can also see that the majority, it doesn't work as they explained it to me, sorry. So I want to indicate. So we can see that the majority of actions are in forestry, but there are also various in crops-related intervention, water, livestock, fisheries, and in general in land management. The more detailed areas of technical focus are, as I said, beyond forest, water management, climate planning, policy, disaster risk reduction, livestock, and crop. There are other drivers of climate change and agriculture in the region. As we can see in the first figure, natural disasters in this region has grown constantly. Also the share of emission is also very strongly, as in other region, determined by enteric fermentation and livestock production. And also, if we see this image, we see that projected changes in crop yield in no location. We can see red is a negative impact, will be strongly impacted negatively compared to positive impacts that will decrease. That this is basically the green part. There are also system trends, especially this is more for Southeast Asia. Agricultural production, for example, is mechanization is spreading, and efficient farming system are reducing negative impacts. Also, there start to be some integration with ICT and with other technologies that improve, especially improve monitoring, and as we said also yesterday, it creates new business opportunity. that create the need for new institution or institution that can evolve to bring the latest technologies to farmers, especially to small farms. So in this context, we may discuss how, this session discuss about value chain integration, but what is the relation between value chain and climate risk? So I will now present discussions that are based on literature from also other FAO partners or other researchers. The effect of climate change can affect, in generally speaking, business. In fact, the level of affection can be from the core operation point of view, so physical assets, lack of production, processes, and monitoring, etc. But can also affect the entire value chain. In fact, it can affect the supply of natural resources, the workforce, the demands for goods and services, and also the availability of input. However, there are also effects of climate change on the broader network. For example, climate change can disrupt the electricity, the water network. It can also disrupt the transportation, so customer cannot reach market, etc., etc. So the climate risk that are created by climate change and the value chain are quite wide. But if we work at value chain level, basically the work entails various quite standardized, we can say, phases. We have selection of value chain, identification of climate risk, and choice of the best and more appropriate intervention, targeting, and then putting a scale. However, working at the climate level with value chain give a little bit the focus on a single intervention and may reduce trade-off, may disregard territorial, socioeconomic, and environmental characteristics. What does it mean? Just to make an example, conservation. Conservation goes beyond the single value chain. For example, if there is, we saw yesterday an example from a farmer in California, farmer who is investing on protecting biodiversity will often have a large part of the cost, but will enjoy just a very small share of the benefits that this farmer produce. That's an example how working on climate change does not really, on one value change point of view, does not really reward who is making the impact. A potential solution for which FAO is positioning now is working through for value change resilient to climate smart landscapes. This is an example of how some scientists are integrating value chain in the territory. So if you look on the it is the left side. Value chain thinking is presented at the level of production of tables and chairs, so furniture. We have at the bottom an empty land. We plant trees grow, then we cut the trees, we do the appropriate work, and we obtain tables, furniture for our houses. But if you follow me on the other side, on the right side, we can see that the value chain of table and furniture production, it is embedded in a territory. So beyond the forest, we have an horizontal integration and a vertical integration. The horizontal integration is the integration that is based on the land, and so there is an effect of this on this forest that is based on the population, on the poverty of the population, of the inequality, of the lack of labor, or the pollution of the environment, or the cleaning of the environment, cultural services. So what is the impact of this productive general broader landscape on forest? while there is a vertical integration. The vertical integration is, is basically the discussion about the integration between the primary processing and the market, and all the phases that there are between those two. This description of value change in territory has been discussed by various. This is just an example from one author, and it creates, it's a little bit of impact of reasoning, but it's sometimes much more easy to see it at the level of a landscape. In a landscape, we have forests that are cut and replanted by somebody that is cutting it, some producer, and those production goes to a factory that produces wooden chair. But at the level of the landscape, we also have cultural services that are like protected areas in which people can enjoy their free time. For the production value change, there is the creation of transport services that will also empower and create rural economic development. So this is an example of horizontal integration that we discussed before. And then the value change, vertical integration, will not only create wood for furniture, but also energy. And this energy will feed both the growth of the rural space and the growth of the city, which also need a lot of energy. And of course, the pollution created by this process is very much reduced because of the use for heat and energy, but also the forest itself is increasing climate change mitigation, capturing greenhouse gases. To put it in another manner, the landscape thinking is something that integrates the different elements of the landscape and addresses the potential trade-off between the production systems and the conservation needs. So it gives easier possibility to upscale success. This is, for example, an image of what an author called the landscape puzzle, in which we see parts of the puzzle in which generally researcher works in a separate manner. We see part of the puzzle is agriculture, another one is indigenous people, and a dam and an urban area. But altogether they attempt trade-off, and they create this landscape thinking. In FAO, we have tried to make a flow of the interaction between multiple scale, multiple actors, and multiple knowledges bring or may bring to sustainable food and agricultural system. And we have identified the need to work at landscape level by integrating agro-environmental dimension and governance dimension. When we talk about agro-environmental dimension, we define mostly the interest of local community, the interest of local to national and transboundary community and local knowledge, and how those interact with research, decision maker, and groups of people. And then this brings us to the climate-smart landscapes, in which multiple levels in intervention are those interventions in which consumers have a say on production systems. So a farm, that's going back to our furniture level example, a farm is introducing climate resilient low emission or climate-smart agricultural technologies, and these create a sustainable supply chain in which consumer has a say, and in the broader landscape, it achieves impact at scale. This is an example from the Land People Food and Nectar from the Nature, an important think tank on climate-smart landscape. It is an example on Costa Rica, in which we can see a forest. Well, I realize now that you don't see it very well, sorry about that, in which we can see that in the same line, this is a real example, it's in Costa Rica, and you see that there are protected wild areas in which that are also water source for community. There are biodiversity friend farms and small-scale farms that protect the habitat. There are shared responsibility. That means that there are local level planning in which multiple actors discuss on the future of the area. There are local level markets that produce local level income, and there are better pasture that are improved in order to have pasture or herders to have a better production, but also to preserve the environment. And there are agro or agroecological intervention that have the double duty to protect the environment and produce. So you may be asking yourself, okay, but those are just words, and how do we translate on climate smart agriculture intervention at the value chain level? Because this is the scope of this session, right? So let's focus on landscape initiatives that are taking place in Asia and that are also focusing on climate change. So first of all, landscape leveling initiatives are growing in Asia. You can see that since the year 2000, there is a peak or a growing number of intervention in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And those interventions are, this is the list from an article that has just come out this year. We can see that those initiatives are often relevant to adaptation and mitigation, relevant with the resilience, and focused on value chain. Not all of them, but many of them. This is an example in Sri Lanka of our project. In that case, we have a city and so this is also connected to what we discussed yesterday about potentiality for urban development in agriculture. In that case, we have a city in which the food waste is both a solid state or a liquid state, is transformed in composting and is later recycled in urban and rural agricultural areas. This is an example of landscape level integration of activity in which multiple actors interact and in which the decisions are not taken at the single value chain but at the multiple value chains. In fact, we have a benefit in the point of view of the reduction of health risk in the city. There is a benefit for climate resilience in agriculture because we have organic fertilizer that make healthier, more resilient soil. Also, more resilient soil will store greenhouse gases, and so they will increase mitigation. The factory that produce compost has created new jobs, and through taxation, of course, there is a small increase in income in the municipality that transform the cost of collecting waste into income through the selling of fertilizer. Another very well-known technology that can be considered a landscape-level intervention is conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture has been, this is an example from a project that has given the possibility to farmers to have very small-scale equipment, and of course, there is a higher protection through conservation agriculture allows for protection of the soil through mulching and through intercropping in this case. Conservation agriculture has in Timor Leste increased yield and production through less fertilizer use and less pesticide. with small-scale machinery and saving labor cost. This has, of course, increased profits and has created a lower need for water-related infrastructure. And this is where the landscape-level thinking arrives, because there is a protection of the soil through the soil cover, but also an increment of water for all the different actors. And of course, conservation agriculture is more tolerant to climate extreme in principle, and that has decreased the impact of drought, flood, and temperature on the production, but also on the entire landscape by protecting the soil. This is just an example. For example, in production, we have a comparison between conservation agriculture and non-conservation agriculture in the photo, but more important, in the graph, we see that the survival rate over a season is much higher on the conservation agriculture plot compared to the non-conservation agriculture subplot. Another example is an example from Lao PDR, in which the landscape inclusive development started from the processing people in a rice value chain to expand to multiple actors and multiple value chains later on. In that case, a very small grant started financing rice millers in Laos. Those rice millers wanted to have more revenue, so their interest was for themselves. To have more revenue, they realized that there was need to train better smallholders group and farms to have higher production of rice to be processed into the rice millet. In that case, so they helped reinforcing the extension system in the country, and the production increased. From one side, this created groups of farmers, and so basically there was on that direction a higher price, because there was a capacity of millers and farmers to work together, and so in that direction the revenue increased for everybody. But on the other direction also, revenues for farmers increased, because through the extension system, their capacity to produce more was improved. Then this entire process was translated to discussion with the government, the local level government. And that you can see how this already become real administrative level landscape in that case. And the government helped this entire value chain in this area to have certain small reduction on taxes, increasing again the revenue, but also making that the government was more involved in this entire process. So basically, this was a success, and the small-scale community started to self-fund themselves to expand this idea of having this entire process improved. And those good practices are now replicated in other value chains beyond rice. Another good example is the example of scaling up systems for rice intensification here in Vietnam. FAO has, over the year, used Farmer Fee School for passing information to farmers on sustainable rice intensification management practices. Technically, we all know that those practices are very effective because they reduce use of inputs, including seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. They increase productivity, increasing then the return to farmers and reducing emission. To this system, in the country, there is approximately 1.5 million farmers that are now using those techniques. But beyond that, there is a certain level of investment that have been done in the entire system. For example, it has been an improved irrigation system, land leveling activities, training of labor that is necessary to set up the system. And also the technical assistance has improved. In fact, through training, the engagement of government and private agribusiness on inputs and engagement of training has improved. So the entire rice system has got an improvement to a vision, through this vision of landscape. And this is a publication from FAO in which is visible how integrated systems provide multiple ecosystem services that are well beyond the rice production. So we talk about soil structure, fertility, we talk about pest control, we talk about resilience, of course, water quality, quantity, control of weeds, and then, certain kind of system, even cultural services, etc., etc. Those data are online. Another example is a little bit old, but I think is relevant, is a project on China, in which the idea is a FAO project. The idea was to start in agroforestry and watershed management with the idea of stabilizing riverbank, mitigating soil erosion and sandstorm. Those systems became later on integrated also for livestock production, etc. And they improve the quality and quantity of wildlife and also the recreational value for the area. Of course, the production of poplar later become, thanks also to the local administration, a wood value chain or an industry for production of tables and chairs, again, furniture. So our first example. And this created a lot of development in this area that became famous for production of furniture, so famous that they now have a popular museum. Another example is how to reduce post-harvest losses in the rice supply chain with a landscape vision, and this is in Myanmar. Farmer Field School has been implemented through discussions with the community and local institution involvement. So you can see the Farmer Field School in all those cases goes a little bit beyond the idea of training on integrated pest management. No? There has been a discussion on reducing post-harvest losses. To include this discussion in the health risk discussion, so less health risk for contamination of rice is a manner to sensitize consumers and producers. Different small-scale technology has been used that are climate resilient. For example, dry and storage technology that you can see on those photos. And this has increased, of course, the income of small-scale farmers. So those were just a few examples. To conclude, the observation is that, of course, there are significant climate challenges, but responding to those challenges, to those risks, requires an understanding of a broader system that, as in one of the graphs I presented, is a system that includes the agro-environment component and the governance component. So scaling up existing success requires realistic information, as we discussed yesterday and we discussed also in the next PowerPoints, but it also requires a level of small to high scale governance. So basically, focusing on value chain with landscape vision require understanding and assessing climate risk and drivers, and sound science that is produced with the stakeholders' involvement to understand their needs. It requires governance in which competent institutions are able to address climate change and enforce policies. And it requires to work in the multiple functions and in the multiple spatial and temporal scale of the agroenvironment in order to produce multiple benefits through multiple value chain. It seems like a joke, but it's a more realistic intervention, broader intervention. Also, climate-smart options need to be integrated for farmers, business, and policymakers all together through a process of negotiation of the risk and synergies. And just to conclude, FAO is now positioning on landscape. There are a couple of publications that are going out soon that will set the stage for the next phase. One is, let's say, a corporate guidelines on landscape management, and it's called, it's a publication that will be titled Landscape for Life. And we'll discuss landscape management and ecosystem services provisions. Then another publication that is relevant to this symposium is the updated Climate Smart Agriculture Source Book. FAO has produced a Climate Smart Agriculture Source Book like 5 or 6 years ago. It will be updated. And this new version will use landscape approach as the hub for managing natural resource management, sustainable and biodiverse production systems.